South Sudan's army is being accused of having free rein to murder, rape and loot in the central state of Unity. Amnesty International made the allegations in a new report. The group interviewed civilians fleeing the violence from military operations that began in April and continued despite the most recent ceasefire in June. A civil war broke out in South Sudan 5 years ago, and Amnesty says war crimes are all too common because the government doesn't prosecute the perpetrators. Well, joining me now from our London studio is the co-author of the Amnesty International report, Joanne Mariner. Joanne, good to have you on the Newsmakers. We're going to have a representative of the South Sudanese government in a few moments, so I guess it's my job to get as much clarity out of you as possible before I pose some of these extraordinary allegations to him. How certain can we be that all this torture and rape and killings took place?
I think we're very certain. I mean, sadly, we received multiple, consistent, overlapping testimonies, many referring to the same event, so we would hear about the same event from multiple sources. We interviewed, for this report, 100 displaced people who came from dozens of villages, who described dozens of incidents. There was a similar report by the UN that was based on an even larger number of testimonies. And probably, I guess, most compelling of all, this is one of many offenses over the past several years where we've seen the same kinds of acts of violence been carried out, the same kinds of atrocities. And in fact, Amnesty International sent a letter to the South Sudanese government in 2016 naming some of the people that we believed were responsible for the atrocities in Southern Unity State at that period. We never received a response. Now with this latest offensive, we find that some of those same people are implicated in the atrocities. So I think when you speak to the South Sudanese government representative, it would be very good to ask him about the question of impunity, of lack of accountability.
Certainly, and I will. Is it absolutely clear to you that government soldiers deliberately targeted civilians?
Yes, we have multiple overlapping accounts of a pattern by which government soldiers with allied youth militia deliberately attacked civilian villages. They burned down civilian houses. They chased civilians into the swamp, deliberately targeting them. And we have eyewitness accounts from people who saw, for example, their husbands killed right in front of them, other relatives killed right in front of them. They also burned many of the houses that included old people and disabled people who were unable to flee. So, you know, there was quite a heavy civilian toll in this last offensive, and I think it can be directly attributed to the government.
It's a civil war, and many will look at it and say, well, everybody's killing everybody. What's the ratio of blame in this latest spate of violence when we look at whether it's the government forces or Machar's forces? Who's doing most of the killing?
I mean, certainly in the past, Machar's forces have equally been responsible for serious atrocities, including massacres. This offensive, however, was a government offensive. So the government was seeking to essentially clear out the population from rebel-controlled areas. So they were attacking the villages. They seemed to conflate the civilian population with the opposition. So they treated everyone as if they were a member of the opposition, even children, even women, even pregnant women. So, I mean, in this case, it's certainly government forces that were responsible for the violations.
Were these war crimes?
These were war crimes. These were also crimes against humanity.
And when we look at some of the complexities of it, was the killing done along ethnic lines at all?
Many, or probably even most of the government forces were Dinka, and many people, you know, they were carrying out rape that seemed to be ethnically motivated. However, they were also assisted by youth militia from Unity State who were members of the same ethnic group as the victims, who were Nuer. So there was an ethnic element, but there was also a very strong political element. It was, do you support the government or not? And the victims were people who were perceived as not supportive of the government.
So far, the government has rejected your report. So before I bring in Ateny from the government, very directly, what's your message to them with regards to your report and moving forward?
I think these reports of atrocities based on field research and eyewitness testimony have been too frequent for the government to simply dismiss. I think the government needs to sign the Memorandum of Understanding to create the hybrid court that it promised to create 3 years ago, and it needs to take real steps towards establishing accountability for these serious violations.
Joanne Mariner from Amnesty International joining us from London. Thank you very much. Let's open up the discussion to our panel now. Joining me now in Juba is Ateny. He's the press secretary for South Sudanese President Salva Kiir. In Addis Ababa is Klem Ryan, former coordinator of the UN Security Council panel of experts on South Sudan. And finally, Brian Adeba is in Washington, D.C. He's the deputy director of policy for the Enough Project, an initiative aimed at countering genocide and crimes against humanity in Africa. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us. Ateny, let me begin with you. We just spoke with Amnesty International. They say rape, hanging from trees, running over people with armored vehicles, little boys and girls being gang raped, 90-year-olds being burnt alive in their tukals, their homes. Amnesty International says these are war crimes and crimes against humanity, and they've been conducted by your forces, South Sudanese forces. Your response to that is what?
I think this is a continued polarization of the country and the army, given that the report did not allude to when and how these crimes were actually committed. There was no fighting that has taken place in those places that are mentioned in the report. And therefore, if there is no fighting that has taken place, the whole report looked like a make-up report.
So those 100 displaced people that they interviewed, sir, those 100 displaced people that they interviewed, they cross-referenced the stories. They all independently spoke about the same things. Who made it up, Amnesty or the displaced people?
Well, first of all, if you approach displaced people, they will be actually talking to you about, polarizing government. And this is what exactly has happened. And this is not the first time that the Amnesty International has cut and faced the same report time and again. When in actual fact, if Amnesty International is actually serious, then they should look at the reason why certain crimes happened by certain individual, and that is because there was fighting in the country. Now the country is looking, for the way out. That's why the peace agreement was signed, and now it is the beginning of the implementation of the peace agreement.
Okay, so let me bring in
the
Brian
revitalized peace agreement, which will bring an end to the
Yes, everybody wants it to end, but if there are crimes being committed, there are crimes being committed. Brian Adeba, what's more likely? That Amnesty International has made all of this up, or that the presidential spokesman, Mr. Ateny, is in denial of obvious facts?
Thank you. I think Mr. Ateny is in denial of the fact that this government the government forces are responsible for egregious acts of human rights abuses in South Sudan since this war started. This is not a new phenomenon. This has been ongoing since 2013. Various human rights organizations have reported the same scenario. Surely they can't just be making up stories for the sake of it. And the evidence is all around. When you speak to people from South Sudan, that evidence is there. It's also been documented, not only by these international human rights organizations, but local people are documenting it. There's a whole, there are a number of stories coming out from people who have lived these experiences. So to deny the obvious is, to say the least, quite ridiculous, really. I mean, the government really has to acknowledge its role in this, and that, of course, means acknowledging the breakdown of discipline and order within the SPLA. The SPLA training ethos has deteriorated completely. There was a reform process to professionalize the SPLA in 2012. that process itself has been stymied with the onset of the war. And you have a behavior that can be described as the behavior of brigands in the SPLA. And the majority of the SPLA soldiers are like that. And it's not a new thing, actually.
So, Ateny, I'm going to give you a chance to respond, but let me bring in Klem Ryan for the moment. Klem Ryan, when you read the Amnesty report, your immediate reaction was what?
That we've read this and seen these actions consistently over the last 4.5 years around the country. The report is entirely credible. There is ample forensic evidence to back it up. The report even mentions some of the elements that women who have been raped, MSF clinics, MSF does not make up allegations about these kind of things. Unmissed person around reported the same things. Humanitarian organisations were actually withdrawn during the fighting. I find the presidential spokesperson's position extraordinary, because basically he seems to be the only person I've encountered in South Sudan who actually doesn't believe that this actually occurred. I was in Juba during the period when this fighting was going on in the United States. I spoke with some of the most senior members of the government. They admitted fully that this fighting was occurring, had different stories about who was involved and why, but they certainly didn't deny that it was occurring. So this is a new position from the government.
Ateny, why the denial? The odds seem to be stacked against you. What's wrong with admitting, okay, some terrible things must be happening and we need to sort it out? The evidence seems to be overwhelming.
No, first of all, I'm not in denial. But Brian Adeba is the one that is denying, simply because he referred to the SPLA as brigand. For South Sudanese to refer to the SPLA that liberated this country as brigand is quite unfortunate. This country was not given by Amnesty International. It was fought for by the people of South Sudan. It's not a free of charge. Brian Adeba, you live in Washington, D.C., and you think that the SPLM or the SPLA has just, turned into a brigand overnight.
Okay, but
there's
sir, does
no
that
new
mean
army.
that,
It is the same
does
army
that mean
liberated
because
to come to the
because
point,
you fought for the liberation? Sir, sorry to interrupt you. Does that mean that because you fought for the liberation? Because you fought for the liberation of the country, does that make you immune from criticism? Does that mean that anything that happens after that cannot necessarily mean that anybody, especially South Sudanese, can criticize you because you fought for the liberation of the country?
No, that is not the case, my friend. The case is this. In any situation, in any war situation, some individuals may take law into their own hand. I've been saying this time and again. That has never been this policy of any government in the world. All the government in the world, including that of South Sudan, have the obligation to protect the civilians. And at time of war, civilians can run into risk of the crossfire. And that is always counted as an isolated incident.
You talk about running into the risk of crossfire, right? Now, when people are raped, when people are hanged from trees, when they're run over with armored vehicles, when little boys and girls are gang raped, when people as old as 90, I mention again, are burnt alive in their homes, that's not crossfire. That's not two armies fighting against each other and civilians caught in the middle. That's people who are deliberately targeted. It would take an enormous creativity to invent these stories. So again, what's more likely, that Amnesty's made all this stuff up, or that you have a serious problem that you need to look at, and you owe it to your people to look at it seriously rather than just rejecting and denying everything?
No, I'm not denying. The truth of the matter is that whenever there is a situation whereby an individual has taken law into his or her own hand, the government of South Sudan has been always there to make sure that it brings that person who have taken law into his own or her own hand into book. And the example is the tearing, where the 10 soldiers who actually gang raped foreign aid workers. And at the time when there was fighting in Juba on the wake of July 8th incident in Juba, those people were now locked up, for
so let me take that. Let me pose that to Brian.
And some are going for 15 years.
Okay, so Brian, we
are not there to allow anybody to do anything.
We talk about accountability. Really? Amnesty said no accountability and there's complete impunity, right? Brian, Ateny says, well, hold on,
Yep.
10 soldiers went to prison for raping foreign aid workers and murdering a local journalist. So there is accountability. What do you think, Brian?
Yeah, I think, first of all, let me just say that holding the perpetrators of the Terrain Hotel incident accountable is a positive step. However, I must note that this happened after immense international pressure. The government was very reluctant to go ahead and prosecute those who committed those atrocities. In the light of these reports that are coming out frequently from the UN, from Amnesty International, from Human Rights Watch, from local residents about egregious human rights abuses, I think it is time that the government also replicates what it did at the Terrain Hotel with the Terrain Hotel perpetrators and hold those people accountable. Secondly, I think that the international community, in light of these reports that are coming out frequently, the international community has to play its role by enacting consequences on the perpetrators of this violence. One of the things that can be done is to enact pressures, financial pressures, targeted on individuals who are complicit, individuals who have command and control. Targeted sanctions on these people to ensure that there are consequences for their impunity, that they don't move their money around, that they don't travel, that they don't continue to perpetuate this violence. And then the other thing to do is actually to ensure that there's an arms embargo on the country, an arms embargo that is enforceable, and that means asking the neighboring nations and the neighboring states to actually play their role in enforcing these sanctions,
right,
so that the impunity that is ongoing in South Sudan, the people behind it are held accountable.
Klem Ryan, what do you think? How do you stop the violence and who gets to enforce it?
There is absolute impunity in South Sudan. That's been well documented. The terrain events aside, which is a very particular case, talking about 10 low-ranking soldiers against the backdrop of a war in which you have millions of people forced from their homes, hundreds of thousands have likely died in the last 4 years. And the presidential spokesman would have you suggest that the terrain example is their paradigm of accountability. If you look when they replaced the Chief of General Staff for the SPLA recently, they promoted Jock Riak, who is under UN sanctions for committing or leading operations which involved similar atrocities as those that have just been documented in Unity State. So we see the same thing time and again. And as the Amnesty representative accurately pointed out, the individuals who committed these atrocities in 2018 were also suspected of involvement in atrocities in 2014 and 2015. There is no accountability in South Sudan for these things.
Ateny, very finally, can we trust that you are committed to peace?
Yes, for sure. We are committed for peace. That's why we sign it, and we have the political will to implement it. But to come back to the point, Brian Adeba is an activist, and there's no time an activist has stopped criticizing government. Even the superpower like United States of America still has an activist that are criticizing it. They wanted a country to be perfect. But the Tehran case was not influenced politically. This is the work of the court that can be commanded. The government of South Sudan has a political will to bring to book those who commit crimes against humanity when they are found. It has never been a policy of government to let people go away with impunity. The government of South Sudan has the ability and will to make sure that it brings to book those who have committed crimes against humanity. But it cannot be done in the way those activists like Brian Adeba would want to see it happening. If it is those of Brian Adeba and his Enough project, they want to see the South Sudan taking people in mass into imprisonment, so that they become happy that the accountability has started. If the accountability started the way it has started, as now we see 10 soldiers who have taken law into their own hand being locked up, this is something that should be actually appreciated and in the right direction.
Okay, Ateny and Brian, unfortunately,
yes,
I've got to wrap. I'd love to have both of you on the program again to address some of these issues. There's a lot to talk about. We're not going to take our attention off South Sudan, I can guarantee. that. Klem Ryan, Brian Adeba, Ateny, and earlier Joanne Mariner, I thank you all for joining us on the Newsmakers.